Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and this video is to say goodbye, Nazarbayev. So it was only a few hours ago that President Nursultan Abishuli Nazarbayev announced his resignation with immediate effect. So he's standing down as president of the Republic of Kazakhstan, but he remains leader of the nation, which is a separate title which he'll hold for life. So he can still be the power behind the throne, as it were. So N.A. Nazarbayev is now 78 years old, and he's obviously not as healthy and fleet-footed as he once was. So many Kazakhs consider him to be above reproach and feel they have a debt of the most inexpressible gratitude towards him. For many Kazakhs, the now former president is on a higher plane. And I just listened to his resignation oration, and in which he outlined the testing times that he'd faced. So he took over as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Kazakhstan in 1989. Of course, in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. So he became president of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan resumed her sovereignty. He outranked all other former USSR leaders in being the last surviving ruler from the Soviet era, a father figure to the other presidents of the erstwhile Soviet Union. So the statements made by other world leaders are indicative of the high esteem in which he's been held, and of course almost every Kazakh has regard for him. So he started out in perhaps less than propitious circumstances, if one had designs on becoming the Supremo. He came from an ordinary, humble, rural family. He is indigenous Kazakh, so Russian was not his native language, but he achieved absolute mastery of the Russian tongue. So he had no social connections which would gain him preferment. But anyway, as I say, he did very well at school. He joined the Communist Party, which was no easy matter. Only a small minority of people were permitted to join the Communist Party. They had to be people of academic prowess, which is contributed to their community, and have no relatives who had a black mark against their name. So anyway, he made stupendous headway in the Communist Party. He worked in a factory. He rose to a managerial position. He was known as a devout Leninist, as someone who was well-versed in Marxism, a scholar of the work of Marx, no less. This was an era of democratic centralism, and people would say, well, it was really centralism with knobs on. The democratic aspect of it was not quite so prominent. People believed that capitalism was a fruitling waste of time at best. As President Nazarbayev just said this evening, it was a totalitarian system beforehand. So he was a man who was noted for his industry, his modesty, his ambition, not a personal vaulting ambition, but to see his country advance. His humor and his romantic sense of patriotism, not simply in relation to Kazakhstan, but for the entirety of the Soviet Union. His steadfastness and his shrewdness, and these are virtues that are extolled by many writers in Kazakhstan to this day. So the Communist Party soon felt they'd unearthed a gem because of his rare gifts for leadership, his cool judgment, and that's why he was to govern with a sense of mission to bring about the upliftment of his people. So his talents fitted him for office, perhaps uniquely. He was hardworking and competent. Anyway, he married in his youth, and he sired 3 daughters. He's got several grandchildren. So he's one as a family man, and in Kazakhstan, family is everything. People know who their clan is, other than the Great Horde, the Middle Horde, the Little Horde, the Golden Horde, who their ancestors are. They can often recite their ancestors patrilineally for a dozen generations to see they're not wedding someone who's a close blood relative. So fast forward a little bit, through much of the 70s and into the 80s, Kazakhstan was governed by Din Muhammad Konayev. You might, if you see the footage of the funeral of Leonid Brezhnev, he's there, an exceptionally tall man, an indigenous Kazakh. By the way, until the 90s, the Kazakhs were a minority in their own homeland because so many people of other ethnicities had moved in, particularly Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, Jews, Tatars, Koreans, Germans, I could go on. So the Kazakhs constituted, at one stage, only 30% of the populace of the Kazakhstan Republic. And so Kanaev was pressurized into standing down, and he was replaced by Gennady Kolbin, a Muscovite who'd never set foot in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, and he made a few injudicious decisions, and unfortunately he did not meet with a warm welcome. He was unpopular. There was a huge-scale protest at Almaty, of course that being the capital of Kazakhstan at the time. Farther the apple it means Almaty. And there then took place the Zheltoksen massacre, Zheltoksen meaning December in the Kazakh language. I'm not quite sure what happened, but hundreds of people were shot dead, as the government now acknowledges. At the time, they said it was a riot. I think the 2 people have been killed. So there are many streets around Kazakhstan named Zheltoksan, as in December, in somber memorial for that tristful event. So Kazakhstan is known for having loads of oil and gas and various other minerals. I can't think they've got phosphate and so on. Also being the site of Baikonur, the space station. Now, President Nazarbayev, well, he wasn't president back then, he spoke out against independence, said, no, we ought to remain connected to Russia and the other Soviet republics. It's an unbreakable union, as the Soviet anthem said. And he felt it would be an epic blunder to sunder the union. Anyway, because the union ensured unfettered access to each other's natural resources and talent and labour and all the rest of it. And they were safer, stronger, happier, freer together, better off together. But anyway, the momentous decision was made to break up the Soviet Union, and with a heavy heart, he finally agreed to that. But he prevailed upon the Russian community to stay. The Russians, who formed an ethnic minority in many other Soviet republics, mostly decamped in 1991. And I have a very dear friend who grew up in Georgia. She's ethnically Russian, and she said that the end of the Soviet Union wrecked her life and never recovered from it. They lost everything. They fled for their lives with a suitcase during the Civil War there. But that's another story. So soon the Commonwealth of Independent States was established, and Nazarbayev was a founding member of that. This was for former Soviet countries. The majority of former Soviet countries are members of this fraternal association. But in the early 90s, there was the spectre of impending disaster. Many people looked at dismay as what was happening, and President Nazarbayev praised it just this evening, how the GDP fell by half. There would already be economic stagnation in the mid-80s, led to economic decline in the late 80s. The economy shrank, and everything contracted sharply. There was a severe paucity of the necessities of life. They used to bring in the means of life from other Soviet republics and indeed sell their exports abroad. Suddenly this was doing it across international frontiers. As a friend of mine said, we woke up in different countries. My cousin, my best friend, living just over there, suddenly was a separate nation. So there was much adjustment to be made. The economy was almost in free fall. People feared absolute meltdown, but it was a near miss. They say you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. It was difficult for some middle-aged and elderly people to adjust to the new dispensation. The economy was sclerotic at best. A new currency was established, the tenge, as relating to the Russian word dengi, money. And it took a pounding. There was almost hyperinflation. It was difficult enough for Russia with the ruble, but these other former Soviet states with different currencies, it was even worse. Then there was the Tajik civil war, not too far away. There was, obviously, Kazakhstan was not a neighbor of Tajikistan. There was Kyrgyzstan on the other side. So that country was savaged by the Taliban, and Kazakh troops were dispatched to show their solidarity to their former Soviet siblings. President Nazarbayev is a Sunni Muslim, like most Kazakhs, and of course that's completely laudable, but that doesn't prevent him having a zealous hostility to fundamentalism and intolerance. We would say the Taliban don't represent true Islam at all. Indeed, their victims are usually Muslims. So in 1998, he made the epoch-making decision to shift the capital to Astana, formerly Tselinograd, formerly Akmola, as in white tomb, or Tselinograd, like fertile city. Astana, meaning simply capital in the Kazakh language. He may have got the idea from the Koreans, because Seoul in Hangul means capital. And so they built that huge Baiterek tower. is meant to represent a golden egg growing out of a tree from a Kazakh legend. It's 98 meters tall, an allusion to the year of its foundation, 1998. And they planned a new city on the opposite side of the Ishim River from the old Soviet-era city. It was very new. There was nothing there till 1830, and then the railway came, and that was that. And Sir Norman Foster, this most distinguished British architect, was brought in to design the city, and the city centre, the new city centre, is more or less symmetrical. And it's been such a fantastic success that these days Prince Andrew is a very regular visitor to Kazakhstan, but also British trade envoy to the country in recognition of its singular importance. Now, foul and wagging tongues have calumniated His Royal Highness, and in Kazakhstan, such an exalted personage would not allow his honour to be stained. It would take firm action. I've never heard anyone breathe a word against the president, so his contemners would discredit only themselves, so many a Kazakh would tell you. And the disloyal section of Kazakh society, minuscule as it is dealt with firmly. Anyway, the president's brought about economic development, and if you want to know more about this, perhaps the best English language biography of him is one penned by Jonathan Aitken, that former Conservative politician from the United Kingdom who spent some time cooling his heels at Her Majesty's pleasure. I shall not expatiate on that. Now, President Nazarbayev, I'll just give him that honorific, even though he's stood down. He is possessed of the most fulsome admiration for Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of the Republic of Singapore, who wrote his autobiography From Third World to First. President Nazarbayev has read it with a keen eye. So his intense interest in Singapore is he's seeing a country which seemed cut adrift in, when was it, 1965, and how were they going to cope? They've formerly been part of a mighty empire, and suddenly they were on their own, and the situation looked bleak, but with a steady hand, sound governance, the situation was turned around and it became fantastically prosperous, happy, and united. A multi-ethnic society which has got a great degree of cohesion. And anyway, President Nazarbayev wished to emulate this success in his motherland. So many Kazakhs will speak of the elation they feel when they were in the presence of their most august president. So how do we account for his exceptional popularity? I suppose it's the degree of success that he has accomplished in meeting the needs and aspirations of his citizens. These days it's fashionable to disparage leaders who are long-serving. I know in the West, leaders will be seen as superannuated at the age of 70. It's astonishing that Trump is there. The people think they should be put out to grass before that, but no, in Asiatic societies, there's a great degree of deference towards those who are of an advanced age. And I know in the Occident, people considered strength to be a dirty word in relation to a leader, but not so in Kazakhstan. Anyway, and most people in that part of the world would regard continuity of leadership as the sensible solution. So anyway, more people than you might realize would be open to this in a Western country, a leader with real authority who would govern for decades, perhaps a significant chunk of the population in my birthplace of Ireland. So President Nazarbayev enjoyed the fabulous advantage of a very favourable press. The press corps simply adores him, and they often wax lyrical about his manifold virtues and achievements. You may have read some distortions in the foreign media about him, and any Kazakh would tell you they do not recognise the account of their president, which one would often read in the Western gutter press. So many Kazakhs would tell me that it must be a shockingly unprofessional press corps, very disloyal press corps in Western countries, which says things which are disobliging about the president, and these unflattering accounts of his country are entirely without foundation. These journalists must be biased and not at all impartial, peddling toxic myths. But more about the president's manifold attainments, setting up a financial centre in Astana. He thought it might come to rival Dubai one day. It has not yet been realised. Part of the Belt and Road Initiative and achieving fraternal cooperation with Kazakhstan's neighbour, China. So there's a fabulous degree of loyalty to President Nazarbayev, partly down to his personal magnetism. Now, his mood is sometimes hard to discern because he's on an even keel, almost inscrutable, but because he's a very stable character and rational. But just occasionally, when a minister has grossly underperformed, his government minister will be summoned to Ak Orda, White Horde, the presidential palace, and subjected to a public tongue lashing, which we broadcast on television if someone is not measuring up to the job, and it allows the public to let off steam. That minister will be put out to grass and replaced. So President Nazarbayev is a prolix orator, and people are on the edge of their seats watching his lengthy disquisitions. He's like a modern Demosthenes. There's an essential weakness in the West, as many a Kazakh would tell you, and that is instability. The periodicity of leadership doesn't solve problems, indeed it aggravates them. So there's this exaggerated interest in Western countries in diversity. And many Kazakhs would say that Western countries have got dubious morals, and there's this contradiction in the West in calling for freedom of speech, yet shutting it down too often. But obviously in Kazakhstan, extremism is never permitted. So people in the West often opine, even when their opinions are ill-founded and moronic. So the West has no scruple about allowing immoral, abnormal notions to be promulgated, and I can tell you there's no such problem in Kazakhstan. So the Kazakh people are mistrustful of those who preach chaos and upheaval. This shake it up idea, they say, well, we've seen the consequences of that in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and we have no wish to go down that road. So Kazakhstan does not like bumpish and boorish sorts who are dealt with firmly. So no subversion is permitted. Anyway, it's straightforward in Kazakhstan. There's the Nur Otan party, Light of the Fatherland. It's very much a dominant party, and right-thinking people vote for it. It's got its own economic agenda, but the Bright Path is called, or Nurli Zhol. So it's very transparent what the government is aiming for. Support for the president is very visible, and his posters are almost omnipresent, what they were during election time. So the media doesn't scrutinize him over much, I think that would be fair to say. If you go back to 2008, the economy was firing on all cylinders, but then oil prices plummeted and there was some belt tightening. But the museum to President Nazarbayev was still generously funded, and many Kazakhs found it absolutely scintillating to learn about the minutiae of his childhood. Anyway, one of the things that deeply impressed me was religious pluralism in Kazakhstan. The way relations between Muslims and Christians were very fraternal indeed. I met a rabbi likewise, and so that was that. It's hosted religious symposia. The president, well, he's got this droll sense of humour. He likes to celebrate the International Day of Women, the 8th of March, by cracking jokes about ladies. These are respectful ones, mere quips and so on. And he's done so much to improve cultural life, and there's a fantastic opera house in Astana where I watched some magnificent productions of various operas featuring opera singers from Kazakhstan and abroad. So he, as I said, he's written up by writers, and indeed artists have turned their hand to memorializing him, giving him these statements in stone, statues and so on, buildings dedicated to him. So his image can be seen everywhere. And there's Nazarbayev University, which is surely the most respected university in the country. They also talent spot pupils at an early age. They can be sent to Nazarbayev intellectual schools, which are under the purview of the president, not the Minister of Education. And I think that's one of the things which is most laudable about the president's rule, actually. So the country is authentically Kazakh now. It's got a very distinctive flag, because in the Soviet era, it was really just a version of the Soviet flag. They brought back the language a lot. They got their national anthem, which is in the Kazakh language. So the country is flourishing in many respects. But the wealth is being distributed in a more equitable fashion than it was heretofore. He's a formidable figure on the world stage, or was, perhaps I should say. It's difficult to remember to speak in past tense. So you could look at the chronicle of his rule, and it's just a miscellany of achievement. There's been the most unbelievable economic turnaround. Only a curmudgeon would not grant him that, and I think that's how we can explicate his extraordinary popularity with all sections of society. Last time in the presidential election, he got 98% of the vote. An incredible figure, 98% of the vote. Only the Communist Party and the Ecological Party stood against him, who wants to go back to communism. And as for the ecology, well, in a country which makes most of its money from hydrocarbons, the environment cannot assume too high a priority. So there will be lingering nostalgia for President Nazarbayev. Now he has chosen to stand down. So he was not peddling an ideology, he was all into expediency. And the fruits of this pragmatic policy can be seen if you're walking through Astana. It resembles an affluent city in the west. There are many showpiece buildings like Severnoye Sayane, and it's the best-looking modern city in Central Asia. There's this international financial center with judges to adjudicate cases, judges from many different countries, including the United Kingdom. So anyway, the former Speaker of the Senate, Tokayev, has been shoehorned into office. He's now acting president, and it's likely he will carry on Nazarbayev's term until April next year. And if he allows his name to go forward for election, well, I think it would be a racing certainty that he will be returned. I remember on Christmas Eve, 1999, when President Yeltsin announced that he was stepping aside, and he appointed the Prime Minister, Putin, acting president, and then Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin served as both president and prime minister at the same time, which was faintly surprising. And then he stood for election. When was it? May 2000, and was soundly elected. So I think a similar thing will take place in Kazakhstan. So this new man, President Tokayev, was not plucked from obscurity. He's held many senior positions, including prime minister for several years, and he was a diplomat in China for a long time, and he can converse fluently in the Mandarin language, and he's also achieved absolute mastery of the English tongue. So we may infer from this that this is part of the China pivot, and I don't know who was privy to the decision to appoint this man, President Tokayev. I don't think he was talked about as a likely person to be groomed for succession until quite recently. So it'll be very difficult to live up to what's gone before. There's certainly a hard act to follow. So the onus is on this new incoming president to continue the Trojan work of his most glorious predecessor. Because for many Kazakhs, the name Nazarbayev will be illumined in glory for all millennia. What's next? So I think we'll expect to see nothing unsettling. Certainly there'll be no turmoil now the presidential baton has been passed on. So this new man has been appointed because he will guarantee the former president dignity in his retirement, and he shan't be hassled by anybody. President Tokayev is 65, so he may not have quite such a shelf life as his distinguished predecessors did. So many people will now pray that the Almighty shall grant many years of health and happiness to former President Nazarbayev. And they will also want the Almighty to strengthen the arm of the new president and guide him to rule with wisdom and foresight. So the craving for strong leadership is deeply embedded in the psyche of the Kazakh people. So this means that Kazakhstan will attain a high standing on the world stage, and the Kazakhs consider that to be crucial. Respect, face, the country shall not stumble. So the new president is not a gregarious type. That would be an understatement. He is in fact serious-minded. You can tell that just from gazing at his physiognomy. But he has a wise countenance. I think anyone would say that. So he is taken up a grave task, being president of Kazakhstan, and he'll have a workmanlike approach. So don't expect any shake-ups. The task at hand is to continue to diversify the economy, to move away from over-dependence on hydrocarbons. So the ship of state needs a steady hand. And of course, President Nazarbayev was a magnificent helmsman for 3 decades. So the economy is not thriving as it once was. It's still doing fairly well. And the universities are teeming with intellectual life. The country is blossoming in many respects, but I think they're seeking higher goals. I think that Kazakhstan can do better yet. So I don't think it's about to morph into the next Singapore, but if it's at least traveling in that direction, that would be welcome. So there's some stubborn negative beliefs in the Occident about Kazakhstan, and those ought to be dispelled.